All right, let's dive in. This time, we're taking a closer look at, well, I guess you could say a bit of a legend, Fidel Castro.
Yeah, Castro.
And I think a lot of people, when they hear that name, there's that immediate image, right? The beard, the cigar, the whole revolutionary vibe.
Oh, absolutely. The uniform.
But we're going to go deeper than that, right? We're starting with his Wikipedia entry and seeing what's there beyond the pop culture version of Castro.
Right.
So where do we even begin with a figure like this? I mean, his life is practically a history book in itself.
Well, I think one of the most important things to consider, and this is something that often gets overlooked, is that Castro wasn't just, born into privilege. He actually actively rejected it. It's
Right.
not like this was some, spoiled rich kid who just suddenly decided to become a communist one day.
Right, it was a process. So even in his youth, we see signs of this.
Exactly. Even as a student, he was already an activist, putting himself out there, taking risks for causes he believed in, not just talking the talk, you know?
That's interesting because it sets the stage for him being more than just like a figurehead later on.
Yeah. This is someone who's willing to get involved from the get-go.
Get his hands dirty, so to speak.
And there's this event early on that really highlights this for me. It's called the Bogotazo.
Procotazo.
Yeah, it happened in Colombia in 1948. Castro was actually there during these, massive riots, witnessing firsthand the power of people, even when it gets chaotic.
Whoa, okay, so that must have left an impression. But at this point, he wasn't like a full-blown Marxist yet, right?
So, not quite. His ideology was definitely still developing, but seeing the Bogotazo, I think, solidified something in him, this deep identification with, the struggles of everyday people, almost like it set the stage for his later embrace of Marxist ideas.
Interesting. So how did that embrace happen? Was it a sudden thing or more of a gradual shift?
It was a process, for sure, but there's this key moment Castro himself described. He was in a Havana bookstore, just browsing, and he stumbles upon the writings of Karl Marx. It's like a light bulb went off. It clicked for him.
So was that unusual for the time? I mean, were people just randomly reading Marx like it was the latest bestseller?
Well, not exactly random. You got to remember, this is the mid-20th century. Marxist thought was super influential among intellectuals all over the world. It was the political theory to debate. And Castro was right in the mix.
So he's got this growing revolutionary spirit influenced by Marx. But he wasn't always against Batista, right? I mean, Batista was the dictator he eventually overthrew.
That's true. Initially, Castro actually saw some potential in Batista, even considered working with him if he'd won the 1952 elections, legitimately.
Really?
Yeah, but then Batista stages a coup, cancels the elections, and that's what changes everything for Castro.
Wow. I mean, talk about a turning point. That's not just a political betrayal. It's almost personal, right? Because Castro was planning to run for office himself that year. Batista basically shut down his legal path to power.
Exactly. And I think that's really crucial for understanding Castro's later actions. This whole experience likely solidified his distrust of established political systems, pushing him further towards the idea that revolution was the only solution.
So that brings us to the Moncada Barracks attack in 1953, his first major attempt to take down Batista. And it was a failure, right?
Militarily, yes.
Right.
It was a disaster, poorly planned, not successful at all. But what's fascinating is that even in defeat, Castro shows this incredible strategic thinking.
Because
His trial becomes his platform.
the history will absolve me speech.
Exactly, more than just a catchy title.
It was a whole manifesto laying out his vision for Cuba.
Precisely. And this is a key takeaway for really any movement, right? This ability to turn setbacks into narrative victories. Castro, he used this trial brilliantly to spread his message. He turned himself into a martyr figure.
And of course, we can't talk about Castro without those iconic images from the Sierra Maestra Mountains, right? The beard, the fatigues. But it's more than just a cool look, I'd imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Castro was incredibly media savvy.
Really?
Yeah, he understood the power of image, and he cultivated this, very specific persona. The guerrilla leader, granting interviews, posing for photos. He was playing the long game.
Smart. And it worked, didn't it? Because even today, those images are what people think of.
Yeah, and, there's this amazing letter he wrote while he was fleeing Cuba. He compares himself to Jose Marti, who is, a national hero of independence.
Wow. Bold move.
It shows how deliberately he was crafting his image even then. He knew how to play the game.
So that image he built, it contrasted sharply with Batista's, right?
Completely different. And that helped sway international opinion, which was vital for the revolution, getting support, resources, all that.
It's all about perception, right?
Absolutely.
So Castro wins, takes power. But it wasn't just an immediate communist takeover, was it? There's more to the story there.
Oh yeah, there's a lot more to unpack there.
Yeah.
Because Castro knew he couldn't just reveal his whole Marxist agenda right away. It would have alienated potential allies.
So what did he do?
He forms this provisional government, includes moderates, emphasizes unity,
Playing it smart.
and get this, after the revolution, he visits the U.S., even meets Nixon.
No way. That's wild. What was that like?
Oh, it's fascinating encounter. Their impressions of each other are so different. Like, Castro found Nixon cold and calculating, while Nixon saw Castro as, well, naive, but potentially dangerous.
That's amazing.
And it reminds us that, Castro was operating in this really complex world,
Right.
navigating different factions, international pressures. It wasn't simple at all.
And that complexity, I think, is key for understanding his decisions, in the years that followed.
Oh, for sure.
Which, of course, leads us right into the heart of the Cold War with all its twists and turns. And I have a feeling those twists and turns are going to reveal even more about Castro's leadership, his impact on the world stage.
Oh, absolutely. Buckle up. It's about to get interesting. We've been focusing a lot on the politics, but Castro's personality, I think, is just as complex and contradictory as his career was.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that there's a human being behind all of this.
Exactly. He wasn't just a revolutionary. He was also, like, a brilliant strategist, a captivating speaker, and even, believe it or not, kind of a romantic.
A romantic. That's not the image that usually comes to mind.
I know, right? We tend to think of him as this, like, stoic figure, almost larger than life. But those who knew him personally, they describe him as intensely charismatic. Could command a room, hold your attention for hours, and make you feel like you were the only person that mattered.
Huh. Interesting. And I guess we get a glimpse of that in, the history will absolve me speech.
Oh, absolutely. It took some serious stamina and persuasion to pull that off.
For sure.
But he wasn't just a cold, calculating revolutionary. Castro genuinely loved art and literature, even sports.
Really? I never pictured him, curled up with a good novel or anything.
Oh, yeah. He was a voracious reader, devoured everything from Marx and Lenin to Hemingway and Shakespeare.
Wow, the range.
Right.
Yeah.
So how did this complex personality translate into his public image?
That's a good question because there's definitely a very specific image we all associate with him.
Well, Castro was a master of symbolism.
Mm.
He very carefully cultivated that image of the ever-vigilant revolutionary.
Right. The olive green fatigues, the beard, the cigar.
Exactly. It became inseparable from his persona.
It's like iconic, almost like a brand. You can't think of Castro without that image.
And that was totally by design.
Mm.
He wanted to be seen as a man of action, one of the people, not some, out-of-touch bureaucrat.
Makes sense. And his speeches were legendary, right?
Oh, absolutely. They often lasted for hours.
Hours.
Delivered without notes, filled with passionate rhetoric and appeals to national pride.
I can't even imagine holding an audience's attention for that long.
Well, people who attended those speeches, they described them as almost hypnotic.
Really?
Yeah, like being swept up in his energy and his conviction. He had this way of connecting with people on an emotional level, making them believe in his vision for Cuba.
So we've got the complex personality, the carefully crafted public image. What about his personal life? Was it as dramatic and unconventional as his political career?
Let's just say, Castro's personal life was as complicated as his political maneuvers.
Ooh, okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
He was notoriously private, but we know he had numerous relationships and fathered several children.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What kind of relationships are we talking about?
Well, his first marriage was to Mirta Diaz-Balart. She came from a wealthy family, but they divorced while he was imprisoned after the Moncada attack.
Oh, wow. So that must have been tough.
It gets worse. Apparently, Castro was furious when he found out that Mirta had taken a job in Batista's government while he was locked up.
Ouch, talk about adding insult to injury.
Right. After that, he had several relationships, some more serious than others. One of his most significant partners was Celia Sanchez.
Celia Sanchez.
Yeah, she played a crucial role in the revolution. She was his confidante, his advisor, and many believe she was the love of his life.
It's fascinating how these personal relationships kind of intersected with his political life.
Absolutely. And remember, this is all happening against the backdrop of Cold War tensions, revolutionary fervor, and constant threats to his regime.
Yeah, it's almost hard to imagine the kind of pressure he must have been under. And what about children? I know he had at least one son, Fidelito, from his first marriage.
Yeah, Fidel Castro actually sent him to Moscow for schooling, which shows how close he was with the Soviet Union at that time.
Wow.
But their relationship was complicated. Fidelito eventually defected from Cuba.
That's some serious family drama playing out on the world stage.
Right. And that wasn't the only one. Castro fathered several other children both within and outside of marriage. Some have embraced their father's legacy, while others have become very vocal critics of his regime.
That's pretty telling, isn't it?
Yeah, it speaks volumes about the complexity of his legacy, how even within his own family, there are such diverse perspectives on his life and his actions.
It's true, you can't simply categorize Castro as a hero or a villain.
Exactly. He was a man of contradictions, capable of great idealism and ruthless pragmatism, deep love and profound betrayal.
We covered a lot of ground. Castro's early life, his journey to becoming a revolutionary, his impact on the world stage, and even delved into his personality and personal life. It's clear that he was a fascinating and often frustrating figure. But what about his lasting impact? How do we grapple with the long-term consequences of his actions?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one that requires a much deeper exploration.
Okay, so we've made it to, I guess, the final chapter in this deep dive into Fidel Castro. We've gone from like his student days all the way to becoming this revolutionary icon and even gotten into like his personality, his personal life. Pretty wild ride. But now I think we have to tackle the big question, his legacy. How do we even begin to assess that?
It is a huge question, for sure. Even after his death, Castro's legacy keeps evolving. You've got his supporters who see him as this, like, liberator, a champion for social justice. They point to his defiance of the U.S., the fact that he created these healthcare and education systems that were accessible to all Cubans.
Yeah, those feelings are real, especially within Cuba, I'd imagine. But when we zoom out, look at it from like a global perspective, it's a lot more divided, isn't it?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Critics of Castro, they point to the human rights abuses that happened under his regime. There's no denying that. Suppression of any opposition. Thousands of people fled the island, seeking refuge elsewhere. And then there are the economic struggles Cuba faced, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah, that's what makes it so hard. It's this gray area, right? It's not a simple hero or villain story, at least not for me.
And that's why I think engaging with the nuance is so important. You can acknowledge the positive things, the advancements in healthcare, education, but at the same time, you can condemn the authoritarian tactics, the suffering caused by political repression.
It's about holding those two ideas in your head at the same time. Not easy, but for our listener who's really interested in going deeper, that's key, right? It's not about picking a side. It's about understanding the whole picture, the good, the bad, all of it.
That's it exactly. And part of that full picture is recognizing how differently people view Castro inside Cuba versus like the Cuban diaspora. Their experiences are totally different. And international relations play a huge role too, It adds another layer of complexity.
Definitely. So beyond the debates, the back and forth, what else stands out to you when you think about Castro's long-term influence?
Well, there's no question that Castro had a huge impact on leftist movements, especially in Latin America. Figures like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, they drew inspiration from Castro. His model of resistance to U.S. influence, his focus on social welfare programs, those ideas resonated.
It's that whole pink tide, right? The wave of leftist governments in Latin America in the 2000s. It really shows how Castro's ideas, even if you disagree with how he did things, they had this ripple effect.
Absolutely. And we can't forget the Cold War either. I mean, Castro made Cuba this key player right on the world stage, a thorn in the side of the United States, this symbol of socialist defiance.
It's crazy to think how this one island, relatively small, facing all these economic challenges, became such a focal point during the Cold War.
Right, and that was down to Castro's personality. His charisma, his political skills, he understood propaganda, how to play the international relations game. He positioned Cuba as David, facing off against the American Goliath. Very powerful imagery.
So we're left with this really complex mix, right? Advancements in social programs, but also human rights concerns, a big influence on Latin American leftism, this larger-than-life role in the Cold War. Where does all that leave us today, then?
Well, I think it leaves us with more questions than answers, and honestly, I don't think that's a bad thing. Castro's death didn't erase his legacy. It actually made it more important to grapple with it, to try to understand how his actions still shape Cuba and the world, even now.
Especially with all the changes happening in Cuba. It's just going to keep getting more complex, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. As Cuba opens up economically, tries to figure out a new relationship with the U.S., the question of how Castro's legacy fits into all of that, well, it's going to become even more relevant. Will he be remembered as a hero who made a better future possible? Or will he fade away as Cuba moves into a new era?
And that's kind of the thought I want to leave everyone with today. This wasn't just about, memorizing facts about Fidel Castro. It was about trying to understand something much bigger, the lasting power of ideas, of leadership. How do we reconcile this complicated past with a very uncertain future? That's the challenge.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Uh,
Fidel Castro's story might be finished, but the conversation, the debate about his impact, that's far from over.
and that's the beauty of a deep dive like this, right? We can go beyond the headlines, explore the nuances, and hopefully make people think a little deeper
Mm.
about history, about how it all connects to our lives today.
The learning never really stops. So what will you take away from this deep dive into Fidel Castro? His life, his legacy, all of it. Think about it. Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.